Thank you, Luis Carlos. In fact, all the presentations are so interesting that we would like to continue, but we should also keep the timing. Now, I would like to ask Professor Anis Chowdhury, who is Professor of Economics from University of New South Wales and Western Sydney University. He was also former Director of the Macroeconomic Policy and Development Division of the United Nations, SCOP, and also former Chief Financing and Development Office of the United Nations, DESA. So
good morning, everyone.
Please keep your presentation in 20 minutes, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for inviting me and giving this opportunity. The paper that I did is a very long one. When Vladimir contacted me, I didn't realize I agreed to write such a long paper. Basically, it's a survey of the issues. So it's not an original in the sense I didn't do anything, regression or modeling or things like that. It's a survey of issues that made it very long. So now Luis mentioned about developmentalism. So I said, why developmental economics and what it is? I take the cue from Rio Plus 20, being my previous life was in the UN. So we look at the UN, which are the agreed resolution, where 191 countries agreed to a definition of macroeconomics. So what it says that it promotes sustainable development. Now we have the SDGs. It also leads to sustained, inclusive, and equitable economic growth, and increases productive employment opportunities, and promote agricultural and industrial development. So industry, agricultural policy will be part of the developmental macroeconomics, not just fiscal, monetary, and exchange rate policies. That is additional. And previous presentation, we saw the role of industry policy there. So this is what it is. Why development and macroeconomics? Why is this recognition that in the Rio Plus 20 meeting we had? Because World Bank's lessons from the 1990s. So this is coming from the horse's mouth, not from my mouth. So it's macroeconomic stability interpreted narrowly to mean minimize fiscal deficit, minimize inflation, with the assumption that the more of these changes, the better at all times in all places. This is what we have been saying, a one-size-fits-all situation. So at all times, and these are emphasis original, and you can find in page 11 and 95. Macroeconomics, economic policy improve in the majority of developing countries. So in the sense narrowly defined, but the expected growth benefits fail to materialize. So, and what happened? A series of financial crises severely depressed growth and worsened poverty. So this is the realization coming from the horse's mouth and the lessons from the 1990s. So what are those disappointing evidence that if we summarize, deep and prolonged collapse in output in transition economies. Vladimir showed us some picture on that. More than a decade into the recession, output levels less than their 1990s level. Frequent and painful financial crisis. We experienced that. The peak of it was the 2008, 2009 Great Depression. Lost decades in Bill Sterling's terminology. He wrote this paper while he was in the World Bank. So lost decades despite significant policy reforms. And then this is the former president of the World Bank, Olfenstein, after he retired. This is what he said, excluding China at least. If we look back last 20 years, no, this is what he says. There are 100 million more poor than when we started this business. And the wider income gap, which is we all know now about the growing inequality and its menaces. So what was the so-called consensus? What brought us to that? Because now the consensus, why is this consensus? This is a quotation I have taken from Human Development Report 1991. As you know, Human Development Report comes at the back of the UN publication, UNICEF publication, Recovery with a Human Face. Because in 1980s, when the structural adjustment was in full force, UN did not know what to do. UN has been always inclusive, pro-growth, pro-poor, and that kind of situation. And then Richard Jolly's leadership produced we don't disagree with the adjustment. Yes, adjustment was needed, but adjustment also needs a human face. So the speed was the issue, not the overall, and some kind of safety net measure. And Human Development Report follows from the UNDP, saying that the human life cannot be, you cannot balance the fiscal situation at the cost of human life. So the human development issue comes up. But UN was also confused. Now look at this statement. I gave it as a quiz to the UN officials. I said, can you tell us from where it comes? Everybody says it comes from IMF or World Bank or somewhere. I said, no, it comes from you. Okay. What it says, exchange rate should not be overvalued. Inflation should be controlled. Each country should aim at roughly balancing its budget. Look at this country, each country. And the entire argument was based on one country experience, was Bolivia. So one outlying country where there was a breakdown of the entire political system and economic system, use one country as to generalize to each country. And when I showed this thing in front of the person who wrote this, he put his head down. He said, I really didn't realize I wrote this. Anyway, so, because, why? We should be doing that. Inflation bad for growth and hurts poor. And deficit crowds out private investment. And that causes macroeconomic instability and bad for growth. And so these are the reasons why we should be following this. So there was almost consensus coming not from the only Washington institution, also from New York. Okay, so that's why this is not just Washington consensus. Now, this is the picture I took from IMF. IMF's Fiscal Monitor 2010 May. And this was the publication that led to fiscal austerity. And look at that, the entire the so-called debt and austerity, there's no relationship, and whatever relationship is there, a positive, weakly positive is affected by outliers. Again, outlier determining the policy, not the median or average story. And this is the danger of the policy prescription coming from our experience of the outliers. Okay, so this is not my picture. So as I said, what I present here is horse's mouth, not my mouth. And then government debt, and again from the same source, government debt and per capita GDP growth. The higher the government debt, lower is the per capita GDP growth. Again, that information, if you leave out the outliers, but still there is no relationship. So in simple economics, there's two variable econometrics, simple OLS, we know the effects of outliers and why outliers should be either made into normalities or we just leave them out. It just violates the normality assumption. And deficits crowds out private investment. What are the evidence? Again, from the IMF study, little evidence either through interest rate or exchange rate. And I forgot to put the later references, but this is the reference 20 years ago, roughly. But even newer studies that is coming out during Blanchard's time, saying that, I'll come to that again, some newer one, cannot draw any firm conclusion. That is the Bank of International Settlement study. They cannot find out any firm, Ricardian equivalence, no support for full or significant or partial effect. No evidence whatsoever. And interestingly, Ricardo himself discarded his theory. Barrow raised it as just a theoretical exercise, but we ran with it. Okay, even Ricardo himself, as a theoretical possibility, he raised it, but he said, no, it doesn't work. It doesn't make sense. And in reality, it doesn't work. okay? He himself said, he himself disowned it. And fiscal multipliers overwhelmingly positive, and so, this brings us to the role of a fiscal policy. Now, debt versus reality, I have shown some picture. Now, there is no simple relationship between debt and growth. Many factors that matter for growth. This is this very interesting thing that came afterwards from the World Economic Outlook 2014 onward, having advised fiscal austerity, and the IMF admitted that they made a mistake. The negative multiplier or zero multiplier they got was from the back of the envelope calculations. So this is really, really sad to suggest a policy based on back of the envelope calculations. And this is one profession which I call economist, and should all be hanged, because millions of people die because of our policies, and we don't get any accountability. We don't have any accountability. We'd rather get promotions. And that was happened in the Asian crisis. Tim Geithner came as a young IMF official, decimated that country, and then goes back and gets a promotion and becomes the Treasury Secretary of the UN, of the US. So this is what it is. And we have the cold turkey, the Bolivia case, and Argentina case. And by the way, Vladimir, I'm not Paul Krugman, I haven't got a Nobel Prize, but I did write on Argentina 2002 and the limits of technocratic, and also on Latvia. Anyway, just as to make it lighter. So, and Jeffrey Sachs, with all respect, goes to Bolivia and introduces this rapid reform policies, and he did the same in Russia, and then the consequence was the decline of life expectancy on an average by 10 to 11 years. So that is the human cost of austerity. And actually Lancet, the medical journal, has written a lot on this, on the health impact of austerity. So, interesting that there the threshold, we always hear 60%, 40% threshold. No, there is no, these thresholds are not derived from any optimality analysis. We have to keep that in mind. It was just a figure drawn out of the air. This is another thing. How can you suggest policy based on a figure drawn out of the air? And in the case, the 60%, which is the EU threshold, was the median debt to GDP ratio at the time of Maastricht Treaty. So that was convenient just to accept the median one. And there was no implication, no mention of optimality, but all of them got stuck at 60%. Now, I'm reading this morning New York Times on Italian budget. That the budget they are proposing to EU is most likely going to be rejected. But again, the issue is, you have to stick to that rule. The rule was devised based on the median debt to GDP ratio. Debt finance projects could have large output effects without increasing debt to GDP ratio. Again, coming from the World Economic Outlook 2014. If we read this, then the policy implication will be completely different. Debt finance public investment in infrastructure, education, health, and social protection would boost aggregate demand and productivity. By the way, when World Economic Outlook is what they write, basically they have the industrial country in mind. If the World Economic Outlook is written for the developing country, they would have exactly opposite view, as Vladimir was saying. The clash of the interest is different. The fiscal deficit is a useful indicator of stabilization. This is coming from IMF and World Bank joint paper. The fiscal deficit is a useful indicator of stabilization, but it offers little indication of longer-term effects on economic growth. That is what our development economics is all about, the last one. So some sterilized facts: the higher the tax to GDP ratio, lower is the Gini coefficient, and tax to GDP ratio and GDP growth, virtually no relationship. That destroys the so-called optimal taxation theory. That you can increase tax up to a point, and after that, tax to GDP, if you increase the tax rate, it will have negative impact on growth. That is basically destroyed with this relationship. And by the way, these are the scatter plot is for the developing countries. So this is just a summary of those things. And now another picture. I'll concentrate on the picture on the right-hand side. That is the impact of counter-cyclical fiscal policy or macro policy. If you apply counter-cyclical policy, then the standard deviation will be smaller because we are trying to counteract, and you can see the average income of the poorest fifth of the population, their income, average income will be higher. Because what happens, I will talk about that in the monetary policy thing. If the policy is pro-cyclical, the people who lose their job first are the low-income people, the vulnerable people. They are the one who gets the sack first. Central bank government never gets the sack. The tighter the monetary policy is, and they justify the tighter monetary policy in the name of short-term pain for long-term gain, but the person who tightens never suffers a short-term pain. The salary goes up because applied a very strong policy. Okay, this is the central bank independence. I will talk about that in my monetary policy presentation. So back to basics. So what we do, having that. The back to basic is, I again take the clue from the IMF World Bank paper. I say attention should be focused on the likely growth effects of the level, composition, and efficiency of public spending and taxation. Now, in terms of public investment in infrastructure, not necessarily the productivity will be always high. So we need to, so making a generalized statement that public investment in infrastructure should be increased, but we must also look at the selection of the project, efficiency of the project. These are absolutely important in the policy making, in the details of the policy making. General principle is fine, but in the details, we need to be careful about where we choose the project and where we place that project and how we manage that project. That are important. Fiscal policy that neglects these effects run the risk of achieving stability while potentially undermining long-term growth and poverty reduction. So this is a very useful principle to follow, general principle. Fiscal policy, the final note. No suggestion to deliberately target higher debt. The previous presentation had fiscal policy, fiscal account should be balanced. I would defer that. I mean, I'm not going to say it should be balanced. Balance puts a very strict requirement, but should not deliberately increase debt. Consider countries' debt history and institutional arrangement. Also, sources of debt is very important. Is it a domestic debt or a foreign debt? You have to be extremely careful about foreign debt. Extremely, because ability to pay foreign debt depends on how much you are earning in terms of foreign exchange. There's a foreign exchange risk also, not just your earning, but the fluctuation of the foreign exchange rate also causes the risk. And how we use that debt is important. That is why the efficiency and production, the selection of projects is important. It's not the debt finance, how we use the debt. So just to get anxious about debt, the moment we see debt, we say, no, debt is not the right way. It's a knee-jerk reaction. What we should do, okay, debt, from where debt is coming, where we're using. What I say, A.P. Lerner, I have a learner in his paper in 1940s, he used the terminology functional finance, not the sound finance. Sound finance is always balanced, always balanced. He said it's a functional finance. What does it do? What does the tax do? What does the expenditure do? Is it contributing to growth? Is it contributing to the inclusiveness? Is it contributing to poverty reduction? Then we go for it. Okay? So that requires state capabilities. So improve progressivity of taxation, counter-cyclical fiscal policy, public infrastructure investment, pro-poor social spending, and public provisioning. All this require state capabilities. So state capability does not mean good governance. It's more than that. Okay, it's not a list of reforms that you have to do. The donors for the poor countries, instead of spending money on so-called good governance, should be spending this money in strengthening the state capabilities. In terms of training the manpower, in terms of supporting their budget rather than tying the aid. Now there is a new fashion, what is called so-called blended finance. The blended finance is nothing but promoting the corporate interest of the corporation in the donor countries. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for the very on-time presentation.